that you have joined us today. And many of you I know often ask, why is CSE involved with AMR? Antimicrobial resistance, we all know, is about how resistance to the most important medicines, or one of the most important medicines of the modern age, are growing, and how this resistance is what is now being called the silent pandemic. Because as resistance will grow, those medicines will become ineffective. That's the simple fact of it. We can talk about AMR in all the scientific language, but for you and me as patients, as people who worry about our health and the health of our loved ones, the most important issue is the fact that we have a medicine which is often called the wonder medicines of the modern age. And because of the overuse, misuse, these medicines are now getting resistant. And the bugs that are in our body, or the bugs that are in our body, are getting resistant to these medicines. And that's really the whole issue of AMR resistance and antimicrobial resistance. And this is why the world is very concerned about it. The world has called this one of the top agendas. It's as serious as climate change. It's as serious as COVID. It's the top agenda for the world. And that is why there is an entire week now when we will talk about AMR, its various facets of AMR, connected to our lives, and then push policy to work in our benefit. Now, the reason CSE is involved with this, and the Center for Science and Environment is an environmental advocacy group. And so for many of you, the question will be, why should CSE be playing such a big role in it? For us, the issue of AMR is really about food, and it's about the environment. It's about how we connect AMR and the resistance because of the food we eat, because of the food we grow, because of the waste from our pharma industry, from our poultry industry, which then ends up contaminating the environment, adding to resistance. And that is why for the last some years, CSE has been working on this, pushing and bringing to your awareness what needs to be done. You will remember that some years ago, we did a report on honey. We looked at adulteration of honey. And in that, we basically found that there was a significant quantity of antibiotics that you and I have, which are crucial for our well-being. It was there in our honey. Now, the simple fact is that if you have antibiotics through the honey that we're eating, it is an unintended consequence that the bugs will become resistant to it, because your body will then be so used to those antibiotics, the bugs will get used to it and therefore resistant to it. We also did a report on chicken, poultry, and we found that there was antibiotics in it. It was all being used as growth promoters. Since then, we have worked very hard to basically understand what then needs to be the policy, both at the Indian level, but also globally. Amit and Rajeshwari and Deepak have come up with a very interesting report, which Amit will talk about, in terms of the need for coherence in policy making, even amongst the top global authorities, whether it's FAO, WHO, OIE, because they are giving different advice to governments. And for us as environmentalists, the biggest challenge, and that is why today's meeting, we have called the development agenda. Because for us, the issue is we need development. We need food production in our world. But can we make sure that our food is produced without chemicals or with the safe use of chemicals? What do you define as the safe use of chemicals? How do you actually find alternatives to the chemicals? In many ways, we are going back to this debate as much as what we did in the 90s and 2000, when CSE was deeply involved with the issue of pesticide contamination. Many of you will remember the endosulfan poisoning that happened in Kerala, the test we did of the blood of farmers from Punjab, essentially showing that there was widespread abuse of the use of pesticides in the environment, in our food, which was jeopardizing the health of people. It's the same conversation we must have with antimicrobial or antibiotics. I like the word antibiotics because I think it's much easier to understand. Scientists like to call it antimicrobials because technically it's right that it's a wider term. But forgive me if I often go back to what I can understand better, which is antibiotics. So again, thank you for joining us. Today's conversation is going to be first led by my colleague Amit Khurana, who will do a brief presentation to us, or rather a presentation to us on how we see the issues and what we see as some of the key issues and challenges going forward. I then have three very, very interesting, very important guests for today, speakers for today. And let me just briefly introduce them to you so that you know the wealth of knowledge that is going to come to you. T. Nanda Kumar is going to be is an IS officer. We have heard of him. All of us in India, we all know him well. He's very well known in the field of agriculture. And of course, he was also the chairman of the National Dairy Development Board and has played a critical role in helping us to both form the policies for Indian agriculture, but also being a guidance in terms of how we can move ahead in a country which definitely needs more food, but also needs to make sure that we have sustainability concerns and we had affordability concerns. And that's really the big challenge for most of our world. Manish Shah is the chairman of the National Dairy Development Board and is, I don't have to introduce NDDB to anyone in India. It is the premier agency which brings to us a system, a cooperative system of the management of a vital commodity of milk. He is a postgraduate diploma from IRMA, but I think the most important thing for me to explain to you is really for us the pride that we have in NDDB, and also the fact that it is a model of how you could connect small household level farmers to the production of food. So I think there the question really is, how do you reinvent it, also keeping in mind the concerns of chemicals and contamination. Stefano Prato is the managing director of the Society for International Development, SID, and the editor of the quarterly journal Development. I was telling Stefano that for most of us in the field of development, the quarterly journal Development has really been one of our most important guiding points. It's also, as he was telling us, a journal that has been in existence since the late 50s. So we have to understand how much of a chronicler of the world this journal is. He is also the coordinator of the Global Civil Society Nutrition Group. And that I think is so critical because we need today, in today's climate-risked world, as the world talks about agriculture, we need to talk about the food systems that work for nutrition, for livelihood, and for nature. And for me, that's the conversation that we have to have in today's world. So thank you so much, everyone, for joining us. I'm going to ask Amit to begin, and then each one of the speakers gets time to speak. Amit, please.
Sure. So thank you very much, Sunitaji. Is the presentation visible to everyone?
Yes, perfect. Thank you.
All right. So let me just straight away convey that I would be talking about food systems and antimicrobial resistance. Okay. So as Sunitaji mentioned, and we all know, many of us know that antimicrobial resistance is the silent pandemic, very much unlike COVID-19. And essentially, it is about antibiotics becoming ineffective, treat common infections, saving lives, and of course, those considered last resort are also failing. And this essentially is due to a phenomena called antimicrobial resistance, which is, as I said, is growing across the world, but silently. And just because it is growing silently, people are less aware about it, despite the fact that they are being affected by it, despite the fact that it actually is posing a grave threat to the humanity. And that's why this awareness week we are observing. This mainly happens, this phenomenon of resistance mainly happens because of use of antibiotics. When bacteria get exposed to antibiotics, they become resistant. Now, that basically means that the more we use antibiotics, the more we lose them. Antibiotics, therefore, are considered global public health good, which unfortunately are continually misused and overused and are therefore responsible for this steep rise in resistance. This resistance, because it once developed, because it passes between and among different sectors of human, animals, plants, and as well as environment, the impact therefore is much beyond human health. And it is therefore about health of the animals, plants, and of course, then links to the food security, livelihood, economy, and development. Very familiar slide to everyone who has been working on the AMR, but still very important. It just gives you an idea of the scale of the lives which are at risk if this issue is not attended, if no action is taken. And that is essentially about 10 million lives we are talking about per year at risk by 2050. Another important point to note here is the fact that most of this would be in Asia and Africa is something that we have to be careful about and we have to be cognizant about. As of now, presently, the current estimates suggest that about 700,000 lives are lost per year due to drug-resistant infections across the world. Moving to the losses to the economy and development, again, they are very high. And here too, important to note is that the low-income countries are expected to be impacted the most. In a report by World Bank Group in 2017, they projected different models, and among those was high impact scenario, and it basically says that the world will lose about 3.8% of its annual GDP by 2050. It will also impact livestock production, and about 11% of losses by 2050 in low-income countries, and it will force a lot of people. I mean, it says about 24 million people, additional people into the extreme poverty by 2030. And here too, most would happen in the low and middle income countries. Now, this report, this same analysis actually also shows, it recommends some kind of investments. And the point here to make is that based on certain calculations, it says that investments made today to contain AMR will lead high yield returns, will yield high returns essentially. So, and this slide essentially is about how the issue of AMR is linked with the Sustainable Development Goals. There was this group set up by the UN, Interagency Coordination Group, on AMR, and it has very clearly delineated what sustainable goals, the development goals would be impacted if there is no action on, or limited action or inadequate action on antimicrobial resistance. And you can see just at the bottom of the slide, SDG 1, 2, 3, 6, 9, 10, 12, 17, and there are many more which are directly or indirectly affected, but these are the ones which are most effective. And one of those is also about food. It's about responsible consumption and responsible production, which is SDG 12. Let's just try and understand what is a food system. Again, a very popular food systems wheel by FAO. At the core of it, you can see it is about food security, it is about nutrition, it is about poverty reduction, and it is about sustainability and performance. And the core system, of course, comprises those who are actors in the production, aggregation, processing, distribution, consumption, and disposal of food products. And then, of course, there are subsystems which are linked to it: waste systems, energy systems, input supply systems. And then, of course, you can see towards the outer border of this wheel, the societal elements as well as the natural elements which interact with the entire food system. Okay, now let's try and understand in a bit more detail how the food production systems are a driver for AMR. Broadly, we know that it is the animal sector, which is about animal health as well as food production. It is about crops, and it is about human health, and it is about waste and environment. Out of these four sectors, two sectors clearly are the drivers for this. The rest are also the drivers, but we are right now focusing on the food systems. And you can see on the right side, it is about poultry farming for meat. It is about aquaculture farming for fish meat, pig farming for meat, and sheep farming for meat, and beef cattle for meat. I mean, some of those are not very popular in India, but in other parts of the world, for example, sheep farming for meat is very, very important, popular. Then we have poultry farming for eggs, dairy farming for milk, and very important, as it was mentioned earlier, the beekeeping for honey. Within the crops, you can see, of course, the crops meant for human consumption, and the other, of course, is the farming for animal feed, which we know is actually one big area which perhaps is creating a lot of problem. Now, what exactly is happening when we say that, yes, there are linkages between food systems and AMR? And if you take a look at this slide, you would see the three circles, which essentially reflect different purposes of antibiotic use in animal food systems. And you would note that 2 out of these 3 are actually non-therapeutic. One, of course, is growth promotion. The other is disease prevention. And you would see that both growth promotion, let's say, for example, in growth promotion, it's actually to increase the rate of weight gain, to increase the efficiency of feed utilization. And this is a routine use, indiscriminate use at a mass scale at subtherapeutic doses. And then you would see the disease prevention purpose, which actually is divided into 2 subsegments. One is pure prophylactic to a single or group of animals with no clinical sign. The second is where one or more is affected, and this is a group therapy where one or more is affected. And both of these essentially are chemical ways of prevention which are not advisable, which should not be the case. There, of course, are other ways of prevention, but because this offers a cheap and economic substitute to the prevention approach, this is how it happens. And among all these purposes, what is very important to note is that antimicrobials, antibiotics, which are critically important for humans, and WHO has very clearly classified what are those antibiotics. Those antibiotics are also used across all these purposes. And that is what is the crux of the problem. Now, let's try and understand, so what is the linkage between intensive food production and antibiotic use, let's say, and what are the pathways? So you would clearly see it's actually the availability of antibiotics which allows high stocking density in farms, which allows chemical-based disease prevention control, and which allows the limited focus on biosecurity and animal husbandry, which allows productivity gains, but due to non-nutritive means. It's essentially about availability of antibiotics, use of antibiotics, misuse of antibiotics, fueling and enabling the intensive food production. And then, of course, some antibiotics are also used in crop production as for bacterial infections and also as a fungicides. And then on the right-hand side of the slide, you clearly see how within these subsectors of poultry, dairy, how the movement of waste from one sector to another, within the animal sectors, from animal to crop sectors, how this waste is actually, which comprises antibiotics, which comprises resistant bacteria, is actually adding to more and more pathways. But here, of course, we also have to be mindful that for a country like India, it is important that this waste from animal farms is used, but of course, it has to be treated well so that it is safe to be used. For the purpose of resource efficiency and for the purpose of circularity in the entire system. So what are the drivers and characteristics of these intensive animal farming systems? So one, of course, is on the left side, you would see growing food demand for protein as well as animal protein, growing population, growing income, purchasing power, urbanization, changing food and diet habits, less people and land to grow food, of course, the political mandate for exports and livelihood opportunities, and availability of inputs, machines, feeds, and drugs. And all these drivers essentially are leading to what? Large-scale units with high stocking density, which is a key problem. And we all know the importance of social distancing now. and the use of genetically selected similar breeds for productivity, which are not at all resilient for diseases. And of course, these breeds are kept under confined conditions in close proximity, and there's limited focus on animal husbandry. There's this dependence on commercial feed and inputs, and of course, these farms are often geographically concentrated, vertically integrated by large players, and also involve contract farming. And of course, these are industries, but still considered agriculture, and then so that they can bypass the regulatory attention. These essentially reflect the key drivers and the typical characteristics of the farms. Now, let us try and understand what are the impacts. Broadly, this could be categorized into health and nutrition related impact, livelihood impact, and the environmental climate related impact. Now, let's take a look at what happens vis-a-vis the health and nutrition impacts. We all know zoonosis is a big issue. Because of similar breeds, amplification of pathogen happens. Pandemics happen. Influenza is one issue. AMR, of course, is a silent pandemic. Foodborne illnesses happen. Drug-resistant infection grows. Nutritional deficiencies happen. There are issues of food safety, toxicity, quality. Loss of food dietary diversity is a concern. And of course, animal welfare is also compromised. Then there are issues about livelihood. Smallholder farmer typically his livelihood gets compromised. That's a main issue. Within the environment, we see due to the impact of monoculture, there's a loss of biodiversity. Natural resource degradation is an issue. The processes become much more GHG intensive. Ecotoxicity is a concern. Vulnerability increases to the climate crisis. And of course, there's the issue of water degradation and depletion. So keeping all this in mind, and of course, the global scientific community as well as the organizations know that, yes, something is going wrong. We can actually now see an increased global momentum which is being built up, essentially on the importance of transforming these food systems. And of course, transition to sustainable food and agriculture in view of SDGs as well as AMR. We can see there's this statement that recently came up by the global leaders group on AMR. This statement was about antimicrobial use in food system, which essentially said we need to now change the way we are producing our food. Then, of course, there's a statement by the Secretary General, which also talks about the importance of transforming food systems. And then recently we saw in the COP, there was a lot of debate and discussion about how to move towards sustainable agriculture. So the world knows about it, the world is talking about it, but we have to now see how we will do it. So in summary, what we know as of now is, yes, we just talked, intensive food systems are chemically dependent. Antibiotics as well as other chemicals have played a big role in fueling food animal systems. Food production has grown substantially over decades, and the need to continue this steep growth is further highlighted to feed the growing population. But it is also clear that such systems are not sustainable. They have helped on productivity, but their negative impacts now are very evident. So the status quo, if persists, will actually be very detrimental. And clearly the world needs to find ways to move towards sustainable agriculture. Then the world needs to transform the food systems to move ahead. But the big ask, of course, is to produce more with less chemicals, less resources, and of course, how it could be done and in different parts of the world. But there are several questions which I think we should keep in mind, we should deliberate upon. And these are as follows. So one, of course, is we know that despite such high food production, growth in such high food production over the last so many decades, a big part of the world is still undernourished, is starving, or is overweight. And we have to understand how much of this is also about the quality of food, about the nutrition security. Then, of course, is how much of this problem is really about food production. A big part of food produced is wasted. What about problems in food distribution? And what about the holistic response, which actually focuses on livelihood of small farmers and protection of environment, rather than just focusing on the food security or food growth? Another question is the demand for proteins real or created? And how much from animals? I mean, how much is actually the real demand? How much do we need from animals? How much of the chemical antibiotic use is unnecessary at its first place? That is also we have to understand. Something which can be avoided with basic preventative and animal husbandry approaches. And then what about consumption? How much can be addressed by just making slight shifts in consumption? particularly by geographies and people where high per capita meat consumption is there. And of course, is the solution more about going back to basics, agroecological practices, or use of innovation and technology? Or is it about both? But what is sustainable intensification? The term that we often hear now. I mean, how is there something like sustainable intensification? And if yes, then what are the characteristics of that? And how do we do that? And we also know that different countries are actually at a different levels of intensification. And clearly those which have a less proportion of intensive systems, which perhaps we believe is about India, do they stand a better chance to unlearn and move towards sustainable practices and yet produce enough good quality of food? So with that, I conclude, Sunita ji. Over to you.
Thank you, Amit. Very comprehensive. And I think what you have done is not only just to explain to us the pathway, but most importantly, I think the question that we have been grappling with over the last few years has been how do we move ahead? And in this, Mr. Nandkumar, Manish ji, and Stefano, the reason we particularly asked you today, and I will invite you to speak, is because in the global discussion, we have found there is little understanding also of how we need to reinvent the pathways for the future. I'm a member of the Global Leaders Group, which has been set up by the three agencies. I was earlier a member also of the interagency group. And over these few years, both Amit, Rajeshwari, and I have been working together to really try and inform the international debate of the need to bring some of this issue of the way we grow, what food is for, is as important a debate as just looking at antimicrobial resistance. Because otherwise we tend to look at it from the point of view of just the end point. And that's why this discussion for us is critical. So Nandkumar ji, if I can now invite you to give your comments to this.
Yeah. Thank you, Amit. I think the last two slides have really been something that I would really love to speak on. But before I get there, let me just give 1 minute of a background why we are here. Because let's accept the fact that, you know, India, with its just about less than 3% of the land and less than 4% of the global water, has to feed about 17% of its people. And that, once you say that, the whole thinking in policy changes. So at some point in time, I think green revolution was a necessity. And well, it was high input driven, seeds, water, fertilizer, pesticides. But I think then we started having this comfort of the green revolution. Probably we didn't change our policy, you know, when we should have. So productivity gains happened, production became important, everything happened. But on the other side, we started losing water, and look at groundwater in Punjab. High dose of fertilizers leaching into the soil, affecting human health, and unrestricted use of pesticides, which again is something that we probably ignored at that point in time. Of course, on the other side, there is this argument about right to food and stuff like that, which also puts pressure on the government, on the volumes. And every time we talk about right to food, we talk about rice and wheat, and in terms of millions of tons, which creates another set of problems. But while this story is often talked about, the narrative which is understated is the 55% of rain-fed agriculture in India and its poor farmers. If you really look at them and their resources, we have ignored millets, which are nutri-cereals by any standards, pulses, all other legumes, which are protein givers to the people of this country. And somehow in the agriculture plan, we didn't look at either of these crops or these areas in any sensible way. Though recently, I think these are catching up, which is a good thing. Now, just looking at use of fertilizer every year, fertilizer consumption goes up, and these are chemical fertilizers. And every year you put more fertilizers to get a little less of what you would have got otherwise. So for every additional kilogram of wheat, we are putting in more urea or more DAP into the soil, and then what happens to the soil is a different story. Then you have this big pesticide issue, 292, if I remember correctly. I think CSC may have the latest figures, registered pesticides in India. It's also going up. The use of pesticides, particularly insecticides, are going up. And very often what is happening is that the farmers throw these fertilizers and insecticides without rhyme or reason. Very often it's not based either on the type of insects that are there or on the soil health. That's a major issue. In livestock, the poultry story. I think it is the 80% commercial production, which mostly accounts for the antimicrobial issues. That's largely because I would also argue that we didn't have an Amul for backyard poultry. If we had an Amul for backyard poultry, I would happily be selling free range chicken at a higher price to all the consumers sitting in Delhi and Bombay and elsewhere, and giving a better income to farmers. We haven't been able to do that. In dairy, the story, of course, Minesh will be able to tell you. But my single point on all the livestock issues is the pathetic level of veterinary services in this country. I think we do not have an extension system, and what we have are veterinary doctors, and doctors treat. They don't give you any advice. So given these, what should be a way forward? I think the Indian context is different. So some of the global models may not find much favor. One is, I think we have to look at the next 10 years and push for a gradual shift. And I say gradual because in India, everything is incremental. So we push things in small ways. To start with, I would argue that we have to shift entirely to a sustainable food system approach. Sustainable from all points of view, sustainable ecologically, sustainable to farmers because they don't get an income, it's not going to work, and sustainable for human health and nutrition. Now, what could be the 4 pillars of this? Of course, hunger and nutrition for us are important issues, so we have to address those. Farmers' prosperity is extremely important, and the sustainability of agriculture with respect to the soil and water and stuff like that again. Now, what should we do? I think we should redesign, and probably this policy of agriculture in the next decade has to be completely redrawn. I would even argue that everything else, go back to the drawing board and rewrite this. Let us rewrite starting from our public distribution system. Let's not have this huge purchase of food grains, because there is this MSP issue, but MSP can be changed into a farmer price support mechanism. I'm sure it is doable, because farmers are not really interested in price per se. It's about the income that they get and the assurance that their grains will be sold. So let's completely do this and create local loops for procurement and distribution. Why shouldn't the people of Karnataka procure ragi and eat ragi than wait for wheat from Punjab to come into those areas? So create these local loops, reduce the food miles, and let's have a decentralized procurement system which will address nutrition issues much better than the large system that we are doing. The second is, let's change the financial incentives. The financial incentives today is aimed at higher productivity and higher production, which means it is aimed at higher inputs. Now, what happens to farmers who are nurturing the land, who are renewing the land, who are not doing any harm to the natural resources? They don't get anything, because they don't buy fertilizer, they don't consume electricity, they don't take groundwater, and they don't sell surplus to the FCI. So this shift in favor of people who do least harm to natural resources or probably renew them I think has to be a very big shift. There is enough data available on soil health cards. What is this? This data should tell us panchayat level, village level, what is happening to the soil. And if the soil needs a certain input, I think we should find better pathways of doing this. And one thing which has always surprised me, and I haven't found an answer to this, I always find soil chemists in the ICR system. If soil is a living thing, why aren't there soil biologists? I've never understood this. Why is soil seen as soil chemistry? Is it because we want to keep it toxic and keep measuring it? Or is it because we want to? So to me, looking at soil should be the starting point of everything in agriculture. And if we really want to look at, reducing the use of pesticides or reducing the use of fertilizer, I think we have to look at communities. We have to look at panchayat levels or FPOs or cooperatives. Because what happens really in real terms, if one farmer uses a pesticide because he wants to drive away the pests attacking his crop, the neighboring farmer will do the same. So if we don't have a community-based approach or a cluster-based approach on this, I think we are probably not going to succeed very much. So I'll go back to the same model, FPOs, communities, panchayats, and let's have this entire soil and pesticide data available to the panchayat. Let each panchayat take a call. How do they want to protect their water? How do they want to protect their soil? How do they want to protect their farmers? How do they want to handle their food chain? And I think this also takes away the huge influence of large companies into the system, which is another danger that we are showing. Of course, the last point about pesticides is that the pesticides are sold almost without any restrictions. It's available over the counter. I think the entire pesticide has to be converted into a service, and it has to be administered by people with sufficient protection in a scientific manner. I think that's the real danger. There seems to be the people who are actually applying these pesticides in the fields. So I think we need a more restricted, controlled and monitored use of all these toxic chemicals. They are necessary. I think we can't wish them away. There will be other pressures which will come. I think what we have to do is to regulate their use through enforceable means. So to me, the solution is rewriting the agriculture system in this country to a sustainable food system based agriculture policy, where we look at healthy and varied food to the people, enough income for the farmers, and an environment which will continue to sustain that production with some amount of social equity and inclusion. So it's not a simple solution. I think we have to draw this big picture and then start attacking the smaller things inside the picture. Thank you. I think I'll stop here.
Thank you, Nandkumarji. I think very well put. I think that is really the way ahead, and it's also necessary today because of climate change. And this is not just an Indian debate, it's a global debate. And I think that's really where we need to understand how do we move ahead. Manishji, if I may now bring you into this discussion as the head of the NDDB, how do you see particularly the efforts that you have made to make sure that NDDB can rise above this, both in terms of, we know your business model, but most importantly, we want to understand the issues of sustainability from you.
Right. Thank you so much, ma'am. So, Sunita madam, Sri Nandkumarji, our formal chairman, Sri Amit Kurana ji, and Mr. Stefano, and all the participants of this program, a very warm welcome from NDDB. As we all know, ethnoveterinary medicines have been used for ages in India to manage ailments in livestock and also human. And it provides a simple, cost-effective, and also the efficacious option to the Indian dairy farmers. Majority of our farmers, as Madam had already told, who are marginal or rentless, and they cannot afford costly conventional treatment options, which include the antibiotics. So EVM provides an instant management option to the dairy farmers who are out of reach of the veterinary delivery system, especially in the remote areas. And these formulations we have seen, they are cheap because mostly they are prepared from the ingredients available in the farmer's household, and therefore offers a sustainable solution, and costs are also minimal. The cost efficacy of EVM is also in line with the national narrative of doubling farmers' income, since money saved through reduction in production losses and the low cost involved for treatment of various ailments now. In effect, it's actually the money gain for the farmers. And the animal husbandry sector is likely to face several challenges in an open market economy, especially in terms of better milk quality or drug residues, which will hold sway for the ever demanding consumer. And Indian dairying system, be it organized or unorganized, it needs to gear up very soon if it has to meet the challenges and survive in the market, for which alternative medicine options like EVM can play an important role in reducing the drug usage, especially antibiotics. Reducing antibiotic usage will, I think, go a long way in stalling the emergence of AMR, antimicrobial resistance, which is a major emerging public health concern. Initially, NDDB initiated EVM experiments for management of bovine mastitis, which is a major ailment in the animals, in one of the milk unions in Gujarat, Sabar Dairy, and in collaboration with the University of Transdisciplinary Health Sciences and Technology, TDU, and also the Tamil Nadu Veterinary and Animal Science University, TANUVAS. Subsequently, this concept for management of many common ailments, means apart from mastitis, now we have all the major common ailments in dairy animals, has been popularized by NDDB through various cooperative milk unions and also the producer companies to cover now in more than 1,500 villages. We are working in more than 9 states now, and it from the last 5 years we have been working, and we have a plan to cover almost each state of the country in future. We have set up now about 570 demo plots for medicinal plants that have been normally used for the treatment in different milk unions and producer companies. More than 1,100 veterinarians have been trained. About 7,500 DCS personnel have also been trained for the EVM and its application. We have now a web-based reporting system, deployed for rapid and easy reporting and also the data management. As many participants know, recently Government of India has launched eGopala application, which was launched with the support of NDDB. It has been developed and available on Google Play Store, and there is also a web portal available. It provides the option of viewing both the document and also different videos for any specific ailment in question. So farmer has to just see the ailment for which he is looking for the medicine, and the video and the formulation, how to apply, what is the formulation, everything is available on this app. If we see the empirical data, about more than 5 lakh cases which were recorded in the online system which we operate now, shows a clinical cure of more than 80%. That means in the 80% cases, we have been able to avoid the usage of antibiotics or normally the drug usage which was required only through the treatment of veterinary medicine. NDDB is also undertaking extensive surveillance on the both phenotype and genotype prevalence of AMR in the bacterial agents, causing bovine mastitis in all the 9 states as of now where we are working. and through systematic analysis of data from enough, again, a web portal, what we have observed that mastitis is, I think, one of the most important elements affecting dairy animals. And it is common that treatment of mastitis is also predominantly undertaken by antibiotics. So if we use the EVM, I think we can avoid complete usage of antibiotics for the treatment of mastitis. And our inspiring experience on the use of EVM, as well as findings of the AMR studies, what we have conducted, has been now presented in various international forums also. We have been in touch with International Dairy Federation and International Animal Health Organization, OIE. We presented our papers both in the IDF conference at France and Ireland, and also the OIE conference in Morocco, for a wider dissemination of the concept. In the milk unions where we are working, EVM has been now extensively propagated. If we see the annual antibiotic purchase, just to give example, it has come down by almost 71%. So the earlier expenditure, when we initiated the experiment on EVMs, the expenditure was about 1.89 crore on the usage of antibiotics in 2017 versus less than 55 lakhs in 2020-21. So it clearly shows that you can reduce the usage of antibiotics also, and the cooperatives will gain a lot by reduction in the expenditure on the use of antibiotics. There has also been a significant reduction in antibiotic residue in milk. So we have been, apart from taking data on the reduction in the expenditure on antibiotics, we are also seeing the reduction in the antibiotic residues in the milk, and both the data they are on sync, and they reaffirm the important role of EVM can play in reducing the treatment cost and also the usage of antibiotics and other drugs. So focused efforts on extension also we have undertaken so that necessary awareness on EVM can reach the last mile farmer. And extension materials like EVM posters, brochures, different videos have been prepared. And now it's not only in the vernacular languages like Hindi, but also in Malayalam, Tamil, Kannada, Marathi. Now we have about 11 languages, all these videos and all the extension material available. It's also available in the English. And as I told, all this is available on the digital format also in the app called eGopala, which is easily available on the Android platform. So I believe that for the EVM concept to sustain in the long run, I think that was the basic question. It is essential to have an uninterrupted supply of these formulations till such time the knowledge transfer to the last mile farmer is more or less complete. And that has been the work NDDB is doing since last 5 years. And during this transition, there is an inherent danger of some unscrupulous elements entering the fray to supply ready-made formulations, the quality of which may be, I think, questionable, and thereby endangering the adoption or even may lead to rejection of the EVM concept in a long run. So the best option, I think, would be for the milk union or the cooperatives who are working on this is to fill the gap by strengthening their EVM formulation supply chain by creating necessary infrastructure and also facilities at their level itself, at the union level itself, so that the quality formulations are made available to the farmers. And to this effect, now we have supported Kera Milk Union, Amul in Anand, and also Sabarkantha Milk Union in Gujarat, and Malabar Milk Union in Kerala. They have already moved ahead in preparing and supplying ready-to-use EVM preparations to their members. So it is evoking a very good response from the farmers because they don't have to now search for the necessary ingredients required and go for aloe vera or some other substance if it is not available. So now this ready to use formulations are available from the union itself, and they are presently supplying in sizable number of doses to treat various ailments on a daily basis through both DCS employees who are already working in the villages and also the veterinarians. So if they are called, they will also be able to supply these formulations. And we believe that this will drastically reduce the medicine usage, antibiotic usage, and their cost. And NDDB has been providing now both financial and technical support to establish EVM production plants to the cooperatives. So our grant for setting up this kind of facility for preparing these ready-to-use preparations is about 40% of the total project cost. So that is the support which NDDB is providing, apart from all the technical details. It's also, a great pleasure for me to mention that NDDB is a part of this movement to popularize cost-effective, simple, and efficacious solution options for many ailments in dairy animals through alternate systems of medicine like EVM, and thus helping the farmer move towards a more profitable, healthy, and sustainable dairying model. Use of EVM will also help to rationalize the use of antibiotics, as we have been discussing in the animals, and it will play an important role not only in reducing the occurrence of AMR, but also in saving the more important antibiotics for use in humans. And we sincerely hope that these small strides will gather momentum and are taken to a larger canvas, which will have an overarching impact on the livelihood of the marginal farmers for which we are working, and the all the milk producers of India, I think, will join this movement. With those words, I think I thank you, all of you. Thank you, madam.
Fascinating. Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Shah. Fascinating. And I have been asking Amit, and I think he will be in touch with you soon. We want to write about this. We want to come and visit these plants. We want to talk to the farmers. We want to write about this because I think it's very important for us to look at. I mean, the potential of this is mind-blowing. I mean, not only do we find cost-effective treatments which will work with nature, but most I can also see from what you have just said, look at the employment potential as well. Look at the fact that you could talk about locally made medicines working for farmers. Now, of course, we have to make sure that these things don't get misused. And that, I think, is where the strength of the cooperative system is, that you have a framework. But we will definitely follow you on this because we think it's a very, very important initiative.
Thank you, ma'am, and most welcome to Anand. I think the visit is overdue now. Please
yes,
come.
The visit is overdue. I will also definitely.
And just to mention that the plant at Amul Dairy Anand was inaugurated by our Home Minister and Cooperative Minister, Sri Amit Shahji, on 31st October, very recently.
Okay. Wonderful. Wonderful.
Thank you, ma'am.
Stefano, I can bring you in now. So what we're really looking from you is really for you to help to take this also to the global level and help us to understand how some of the discussions at the global level need to be enriched and need to move ahead. Because it's very clear that, and I'm with the AMR group, I'm finding that we need to make these linkages much more with food systems, with nutrition, with biodiversity, with livelihoods, because otherwise AMR will just become a important issue, but it'll get constrained only in terms of the medical aspects of it. So Stefano, please.
Thank you so much. Thanks for the invitation, and thanks to the previous speakers, which I think have laid very well, the framework for this discussion, particularly the initial presentation by Amit. So let me make two, let's say, clarifications at the beginning. The first one, as you said, Sunita, I will not speak so much about the Indian context. It is not something I have knowledge on. And it's not only a matter of the knowledge I have and I don't have, but many general global assumptions that one makes actually do not work and do not relate to the Indian context. So I think I'd rather try to generate a bit of tension between what is happening within the Indian context, which you know better, and what is happening globally. The second one is that, I'll speak with a dual hats here, not only the one that you introduced, but also the fact that I'm a vet, and I'm a large animal vet, and I have my PhD is precisely on food safety and livestock management issues. So I'll do three things. First, a brief situational analysis. Secondly, I'll try and suggest three major cluster of issues on how to move forward and draw some conclusions very briefly at the end. So in terms of the situational analysis, you're right, Sunita. The AMR issue is a systemic issue, but unfortunately is very often referred in very technical terms. And it has been, despite the tripartite collaborations across the food, health, animal health and environmental nexus, largely been addressed in medical terms. And there's continues to be a very significant underestimation of the importance of the problem in the larger policy landscape. So I don't think, despite reports and General Assembly sessions, that this is on top of the policy agenda, the extent to the way it should be. Let me start with a slightly philosophical consideration. Modernity comes with very many misleading assumptions on our biology and our ecology, but probably one of the most dangerous ones is the so-called isolationist view of the human body, that regards it as a unity which is somehow close to the outside world, and rather than recognize that it is actually a symbiotic microcosm where how our human identity actually coexists with a very complex ecosystem of living organisms in a very open system with our ecological settings. Consider that even the most, let's say, conservative assumptions assume that for every one single human cell, we have one bacterial cell in our body. And there are some assumptions which are actually much bigger than this, So literally this notion of unity that we have within modern, often Western, interpretation is very problematic. And I think this gives you the existential challenge that is posed by antimicrobial resistance. It's not only the concern in medical terms, but we are living in symbiotic relations with our bacteria. So we can't afford to enter a war with our bacteria because the bacteria are our own life. So sorry for starting with a bit, maybe a slight diversion of slightly philosophical terms. It is actually not a philosophical issue. It's a profound biological reality that we often disregard and forget about. Anyway, indeed, it is a systemic issue. I've seen a couple of questions in the chat box, which I think points out to that. It's essential to recognize that, for instance, the fact that we largely abandoned public research on antimicrobials and antibiotics means that, unfortunately, the use of newly found antibiotics, very few, is linked to their profitability. And therefore, rather than being locked in a cave, as it should happen, they actually end up being on the market. And on the same time, there are very little incentives for private research on antibiotics. So AMR exposes the need for a new public research agenda and a new form of international research collaboration, because it's not something that we actually can abandon to the market. The other issue is that there was a question about heavy metals, and indeed, there are very many new facilitating factors. We have been concerned with antimicrobials or antibiotics, but in fact, we are beginning to find out that disinfectants heavy metals, particularly in heavily contaminated areas, can actually be driving an increase in antimicrobial resistance. And therefore, this is where industrial pollution, not only from direct antimicrobial residuals, may actually be a challenge. And lastly, I think in the Western world, a whole area is currently under considered, which is the use of antibiotics on pets. I will not discuss it here because we don't have time, but this is a huge element, considering that only in Italy we have 60 million pets, almost one for each inhabitants. Many of them live very closely within families, and the way in which we treat them with antibiotics is completely disregarding the problem of AMR. But let me now zoom in into the issue of food system, as this was a small diversion, to respond to some of the queries. So I very much appreciated Amit's presentation, but it's important to consider that we cannot look at food system as an homogeneous entity. The reality is our current food system emerged from a tension between two extremely different production systems. One is the corporate system, the industrial production system on one side, and then peasants' agriculture on the other. And there's pretty much nothing in between, because largely the process of concentration of corporate agriculture has been so massive that has literally killed and rendered non-existent any missing middle between the two realities. So we are very often confronted in between peasants, very often small peasants agriculture on one hand, and very large industrial intensive corporate agriculture on the other. Now, when we're talking about food systems, also beyond this tension between systems, it's important to recognize that there is a systematic approach. It's pretty much what also Amit has presented, that FAO describes, that therefore integrates from primary production and all other set of dimensions to what I call a systemic understanding of food system that grows directly from the multidimensionality of food. Food is not only about the nutrients and the meals we take. It's a fundamental element of our relations with our ecology, is fundamental to social and economical relations, is fundamental to sort of gender dimensions, is essential for our culture. So there's much, much more into food than food per se. And therefore, this means that when we discuss antimicrobial resistance, it is important to position it clearly in this multidimensional assessment and in the distinction between different production systems. And pretty much it is at the core of the battle between the industrial food system and different production models. Many AMR interventions have been trying, I would say, to domesticate the beast, to deal with the reduction of antibiotics within the industrial system, but actually not reducing the size of the beast. And I think this is where sometimes our campaigning, our advocacy have been somehow marginal and has skipped somehow the core of the problem. And the core of the problem is that antibiotics are an essential input of industrial livestock production. Amit said it clearly, the combination of genetic selection, high concentration of animal and productive stress makes antibiotics essential. You cannot produce at that level of intensity without them, no matter what the narrative is. And the problem is that pricing policies, unfortunately, have pushed the resulting externalities in terms of health and in terms of ecology of this particular production system onto society. There's a recent study of the ETC group that basically roughly is estimated that for every $1 which is spent in the corporate food products, $2 are pushed onto society for environmental and health consequences that society have to deal with. So you see the extent of the externalities that this particular system generates. Now, the problem here is that the industrial food system has also managed to convince policymakers that the problem of antimicrobial resistance is with the residuals. So we tend to enter a loop in which, as long as the food is is free of residuals, you know, and this has to do basically from the moment when antibiotics are stopped before animals are basically slaughtered. And unfortunately, this has been putting under the carpet the key issue, which is really the one of ecological contamination, particularly of our aquifers, of our soil, during the production process, rather than the actual problem of the residuals in the product that goes to the market. So I think it's also important not only to recognize that this is an essential input of industrial livestock, but the problem of residuals is actually a red herring. You know, it allows us to look, it invites us to look in the wrong place, you know. Now, we also don't have to simplistically assume that small-scale food production is antibiotic-free, okay? Consider that they compete on the same market with industrial production, precisely with those pricing policies that unfortunately push ecological and health externalities onto society. So the reality is that there is possibly more limited contamination of our environments because of the lower scale of production, but, you know, sometimes there may be higher residuals actually in the final product, you know, because you're talking about very often less control kind of production. So the problem is systemic and is across the entire food system. But this also gives us the sense that there are a lot of limits to consumer-driven approaches, including labeling approaches, because precisely because of this continued push of the health and environmental externalities onto society. So how do we respond into this? What are the situations to confront this very complicated situation? Well, three major points. The first one is that we need to get our vision and strategy right. There is no antimicrobial resistance campaigning outside of a food justice framework and a food sovereignty framework. Whenever we target small arrangement or changes at the fringes of the system, simply to try and domesticate the beast, we actually probably do a disservice to the bigger campaigning. So it's important to create much stronger ties between AMR campaigners and food sovereignty, food justice campaigners. And this means, first and foremost, to reject dominant narratives. The first one is this grand narrative of the need to feed the world and the need to scale up production. There is enough food produced. The issue of starvation, hunger, and as well as undernutrition it has to do with completely different dynamics than the production of food. And we also need to equally challenge the notion of productivism, the fact that we need to push productivism to higher levels, and the only way to do it is actually to do through industrial production. This is also a scam. Small and medium scale practice is actually more productive than large scale. You know, it's just that the measures of productivity are being biased to capture the large-scale productivities of industrial farming. But it is actually, there's no disagreement in FAO in any other context that smaller scale are actually much more productive. They have much greater capacity to integrate livestock with agriculture rather than producing this massive divorce between livestock and agriculture that has incredible implications on soil fertility that has been pushed by agricultural productivism. And lastly, we need to interrogate the term sustainability. Unfortunately, there's too much sustainability washing by simply continue to call what we used to do yesterday with a new term that actually adds sustainability to it. Sustainable intensification doesn't exist, it's an oxymoron, you know, and I think it's important to reject it clearly. There's no techno fix that can resolve the problems that the industrial system actually generated itself. Now in this, and to conclude on the getting the vision and strategy right, not only the combination of AMR campaigning with the food justice framework, the rejection of the dominant narrative, but mostly the reaffirmation of the centrality of peasant agriculture and the much greater investments in terms of public policies and public investment on practices such as agroecology. Agroecology, it has technical, social, economic, cultural, spiritual, as well as political dimension. It combines centuries of peasant knowledge and applies them to the management, the holistic management of our agro-systems. There's a lot of potential. It shows that it allows to work in the mix of biodiversity, soil health, and interaction between our social, ecological, and cultural system. So this is certainly the way in which we need to put our public policy and public investments. Now, so first of all, getting visions right, clarify what is the nature of the challenge. But of course, secondly, they can get a lot of policies right, in the meantime. It's not that we need to wait for all of this to unfold. Well, first of all, I have a very black and white positions on growth promoters. I think their use is criminal, full stop. Using antibiotics in clinical therapy levels, it is just a criminal activity and needs to be phased out without hesitation and completely. Unless we do that, and we do that clearly, I think we keep on tinkering with the problem. Of course, we can address a number of critical husbandry issues within genetics, density, transport, performance stress, but my feeling is that these are just very minor issues. One key issues to intervene is to avoid the perverse competitive edge on virtuous players, because if somebody wants to be a virtual player, immediately suffers of price and market repercussions, and probably also erosion of profit margins, So there has to be a way to internalize the cost and readjust market prices, because without it, there's no possibility of those that want to be virtuous to actually engage in virtuous market practices. This also means that we need to shift the incentive systems from supporting transitions of wrongdoers, because this is another perverse subsidy, versus the actual support of virtuous player, and it's important therefore to really leapfrog funds that can help these kind of structural transitions and towards, and they need to be combined with sectoral-wide reforms that once again eliminate that perverse competitive edge. And lastly, of course, it's a massive need to really invest in publicly funded research and reclaim, in a way, food systems policies and investments from the notion that this is abandoned to the market and the market will fix it best. Now, so getting visions and strategy right, but there's a lot of policies that we can work on to shift current system. But shifting policies takes to my last point, which is we need to get governance rights. And the reality is that governance on antimicrobial resistance has been dramatically challenging. The first one is that it's a systemic challenge, but we have not managed to address the fragmentation of policy spaces. Yeah, it's true, there is a tripartite, quadripartite process of collaboration between FAO, between the World Health Organization, the Organization of Animal Health, and increasingly the environmental program. But the reality is that beyond some level of coordination at agency level, the governance spaces where decisions are made remain fragmented and distant. And there has been no change to this. Secondly, we need to fully recognize the challenge of corporate capture of governance and reject the notion of multi-stakeholderism, the idea that decisions on these need to be taken together, including civil society, of course, but also with the private sector. And very often the idea that civil society can engage through these multi-stakeholder mechanisms becomes an obfuscating idea that brings in conflict of interest straight into the system. And in this respect, I do have my own criticism on the global leaders group, because it does embody that multi-stakeholder approach and kick somehow conflict of interest under the carpet by having private sector, including producers of antibiotics, straight into this. But conflict of interest happens at all level, and even within my own category of veterinarians, to the extent to which they are actually veterinarians themselves that actually sell antibiotics. So the issue of conflict of interest runs through from the global up to the local. So to conclude, I'm afraid that we remain millions of light years from addressing the problems at stake. And we keep on somehow dancing in the glory of monsters, to paraphrase a famous book. You know, it really remains essential to raise awareness on this existential challenge because of our own symbiotic nature with bacteria. But we need to be aware there is very, very limited serious political will to address it beyond choreography and spotlight statements, which are very often empty of actionable plans. So I am actually profoundly and deeply concerned. And as civil society, we need to step up to the reality that our strategies so far haven't quite worked. So that's where I would leave it, and sorry for being a bit long. Thank you so much.
No, Stefano, fascinating. I do have some comments, but I will reserve them for the end. But what I would like to do now, we are out of time, but what I would like to do is to go back to the three speakers, including you, Stefano. If you have anything you want to add, either in comment to your other speaker or in any of the question that has been raised. So can I start with you, Manishji? Is there any comment that you want to make at this point?
No, ma'am. I think absolutely fine. I think all the speakers, they are in line with the larger discussion what we had today, and it's important, I think. And
I think one question to you was this whole issue about how you, and I think you have also made a point on it. And I think the whole question is that how do you make sure that the quality of the EVM stays, credible? And I think that's a concern you have as well. So it's clearly something that you have answered.
yeah, so there are two answers to it. One thing is that if cooperatives are manufacturing the formulations, ready-to-use formulations, then definitely there will be quality control involved with it, and the quality will be checked fast before it is actually going on to farmer. That is one thing. Second thing, which I told in my this thing also, is some other player may come in and they start supplying inferior quality products. So I think there we'll have to price the product, I think, which all cooperatives do for milk and other products also, is to price the product so aggressively that it acts as an entry barrier for others to come and start selling.
Yeah, no, very, very important. Nand Kumarji?
Sunita, just a quick point is, I don't think we have done enough to make people aware of the ill effects of some of these things. I think people jump at antibiotics at the first shot, whether it's human health or animal health. I remember how we had a difficult time controlling the distribution of Tamiflu when the swine flu hit us, and and people were not willing even to take prescription. They said no, it should be over-the-counter sale kind of a thing. So I suppose as public health authorities and government in particular should spend a little time, energy, and money on making people aware of what is it that can cause harm if you continue to do what you're doing. Because the change in the market in terms of a preference for a better food, whichever way you look at it, a more wholesome, safe food, has to come from awareness. And you would find that in the post-COVID scenario, this awareness is slowly evolving. People are talking about immunity boosters, people are talking about wholesome foods, people are talking about less processed foods. So I think this is the right time to drive home this whole idea, what is good for you and what is not good for you, and give a preference in the market, because that's where I think the final issue will emerge. So if somebody is doing a good product in terms of a natural food, let him get the price for it, and let's not take away the profit because some industrial unit is producing cheaper. That's the only point I want to make.
Just to add one point, what Sir said about the awareness is, what we are doing is now we are in touch with Ayush Ministry and also with the Veterinary Council of India to include this EVM, as the curriculum in this bachelor level veterinary graduation actually. So that is one effort which we are making apart from creating awareness at farmer level. I think it is also important that it gets included as curriculum in the veterinary universities, for which we have already started working.
Very important, very, very important point. We need people to understand the possibility of a different approach. Absolutely. Amit?
Well, Sunitaji, I think I think the points are raised. The questions are now out in the open.
Yeah.
There are different opinions, but I clearly see one line of thinking that some things are done, but a lot needs to be done. And I also understand that, yes, the issue is much bigger than what we think right now it is. So I hope to be able to, along with the colleagues who are there, to be able to take it forward under your guidance.
No, let me conclude, and thanks, Amit. I think that sort of sums it up. Stefano, if it's okay with you, I will conclude now because we are out of time. And I do have a few more hands up, and I have some very interesting questions. But I think, as in all these webinars, we struggle to somehow be able to answer everybody. But I think the speakers, most importantly, have read your concerns and will try and answer them. So, and stay with us, because this is the first of 3 webinars that we are doing. We are doing another one, Amit, correct me if I'm wrong, on Tuesday, and then one on Thursday.
Monday and Wednesday.
Sorry, Monday and Wednesday. Monday and Wednesday. And we want to take the 3 questions, the development question today. Then there is a conservation question where we are talking about how do you actually conserve critically important antimicrobials, which really need to be looked as global good. And how do you make sure that they do not get overused in the animal sector? So that can you actually make sure that there is such a list that we work together to be able to conserve? And that's really the conservation agenda. And the third agenda is the environment agenda. And that's when we will discuss the issue of what needs to be done with the fact that antimicrobial use is also about the pharma industry, which manufactures this, and the waste of this. But most importantly, Manishji, for us, the biggest issue has been, and this is where I want to disagree with Stefano. I think, at least I have found, and I'm a veteran at global meetings, and I normally avoid them now because I find them just talk shops. But I have to say that the effort that we have made at GLG has been to try and rediscuss and reinvent the agenda. And from the perspective of countries of the South. And I think that has been a very important part of the discussion, and the openness with which my colleagues in GLG have taken this is really very, 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 very important for us. Because when we came to the antimicrobial agenda, it was a North-driven agenda. There was never any issue. For us, the biggest issue is preventive. How do you prevent the use before you can actually talk about antimicrobial resistance? How do you make sure prevention happens? And really, that has been for us one of the critical issues that we have taken forward, that we want to make sure that we have a food system in which you don't have to use these. We want a health system in which you have clean water for all, so that you do not have to use antimicrobials, antibiotics. And in the case, Manishji, for us, the biggest issue was to say, coming from the South, for us, manure and poultry waste is a very important part of the food agriculture system. it is not a waste for us. And we need to find a way that we want to be able to reuse it. We believe very strongly in the reuse of this material. So when we are looking at the food system and the waste from food system, it is not waste, it is a resource. But we have to make sure that it does not jeopardize this health of the environment and therefore the health of humans. And for us, therefore, the issue has been to bring this discussion to FAO and this issue to OIE, this issue at the global issue. Where we are struggling, Stefano, is a lack of engagement from European and Northern alternate food organizations in this discussion, because it is still a discussion where there is a tendency to look at antimicrobials as an end result, not as something that you look at the systemic view of it. I remember when Amit and I began work in this, when I was incidentally made a member of the IACG, getting the very words prevention and food systems was, I think we failed on it, Amit. We only managed to get the growth promoters and the ban on growth promoters in. And now I think the continued engagement and particularly being able to understand the voices from the South has meant that the discussion is becoming much more enriched. It is becoming much more real. It is becoming much more not an agenda where the North is worried about antimicrobial resistance and we in the South are only worried about food production. But actually, we in the South are really talking about how can we grow food which is not harmful to the environment, which is not harmful to our people. And we can take the principles of food, nutrition, livelihood, and nature and really implement it on ground. So I think it's a very rich discussion and I have not given up hope. And if I don't give up hope, Stefano, you have no business to do so, because I'm definitely older than you in these discussions. So please stay with us. Please stay engaged with us, everyone who's on this call. And we will keep at this discussion. We will keep making a difference and hope to make a difference because it is too important for us not to. Thank you very much for joining us, and we look forward to being with you on these issues again very soon. Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Thank you, everyone. Bye-bye.